the government still has plenty on its plate when it comes to Brexit. Brexit Secretary David Davis and the EU's negotiator Michel Barnier will sit down for another helping of Brexit negotiations in Brussels this week. Progress now needs to be made on some big questions. They include the rights of EU citizens living here and UK citizens living in Europe, how to maintain an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and the size of the financial settlement or so-called divorce bill the UK will pay when leaving. Previous estimates have included a figure of €60 billion or higher. The British government has put no figure on it, simply saying it'll meet its legal obligations. This week, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said the EU could go whistle if it was expecting an extortionate fee from the UK. Brussels wants this set of negotiations, focusing on the principles of separation, to be done by the end of the year. They can then turn to the main event, the future trading relationship between the UK and the EU. While the UK remains a member of the EU Customs Union, it cannot sign its own free trade deals. But it can hold advanced discussions with other countries. This week, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said his country was very keen for a deal as quickly as possible. And at the G20 summit, Donald Trump said he wanted to sign a very powerful UK-US trade deal very quickly. But as trade deals normally take years to negotiate, it's unclear exactly when the first ones will be ready for post-Brexit Britain to sign. So there'll be plenty for both sides to digest as negotiations continue over the summer. I'm joined now by the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Now, your brief is to agree new free trade deals, but you cannot sign any until Brexit is done. Can you even begin proper negotiations this side of Brexit, or is that illegal too?
We cannot negotiate and conclude a trade agreement, but of course we are able to scope them out. And of course,
but you can't negotiate.
We can scope them out. We can get our preparatory work done. We've got 10 working groups now established across the world with countries from Korea to the United States to Australia.
But you cannot, I know scoping them out is fine, you can talk about trade, but you cannot begin formal trade negotiations until after Brexit.
Not formal negotiations, but we've got trade working agreements. Now, to explain that, free trade agreements aren't the only thing that are in the mix, as it were. It's the free trade agreements are what people think about, but we've got other things. It's what's called mutual recognition agreements, where we can actually reduce some of the barriers to trade, something called the technical barriers to trade in that process. And of course, we've got a number of other things going on. We've got to get our trading schedules in Switzerland and Geneva at the World Trade Organization organised. Then we've got 40 EU free trade agreements that we're party to. We've got to get all of them ready, because if we were not to negotiate those and be ready on the first day of Brexit, there would be huge market disruption.
Right, and I want to come on to that in a minute. But although you can clearly do a lot of technical work and you can have lots of talk, you can talk till the cows come home. But the fact is there will be no free trade deals on the shelf ready to sign come March 2019, when we're meant to leave the EU. That's correct, isn't it? Well,
technically there will be some new ones, because the agreements that we have with third countries through the EU will be new agreements, and there will also be...
But with third parties? There'll be no free trade deals ready to say, right, we're out, here's a free trade, here's a deal I've baked earlier.
No, because right away, because we're not permitted to do that as part of our membership of the European Union. And one of the things that I want to get, of course, is to get greater freedom to be able to negotiate on behalf of the United Kingdom. That's not possible when you're inside the customs union.
There's much talk now of a transition period after March 2019. You told Bloomberg you didn't mind a few months. The Chancellor this morning said it wouldn't be a few months, it would be a couple of years. What is it?
Well, I think the key thing is, why would you have a transitional agreement? How long would it be, and what would the conditions be? For me, first of all, we have to leave the European Union in March 2019, so there can be absolutely no case of us extending our EU membership. At that point, as a third country, we can have a transition agreement that keeps as little disruption as possible. But again, I think it has to have an end date. That has to be clear.
You said a few months. The Chancellor says years. Why is it that different?
Well, I think it's, as the Chancellor explained this morning quite correctly, it's more a technical argument, this, because, for example, how do we get new border equipment in place? How do we get the arrangements for immigration put in place? But for me, you know, I've waited a very long time and campaigned a long time to leave the European Union. As long as we leave in March 2019, then I'm happy, as long as we've got a very time-limited transitional period, to make it work for business.
I understand this, but the Chancellor doesn't deny the transition could take up to 4 years. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, says it could be a maximum of 3 years. You're talking months. Shouldn't you sort out this message round the cabinet table instead of all three of you sending mixed messages to business and to voters?
Well, it will be dependent upon what, for example, HMRC tell us in terms of our customs capability, how the investment in that is going. It's also a question of negotiating with our European partners. We know
what's involved. Why are you all sending out these mixed messages?
Well, I don't have a problem with the transition period as long as it's time limited, and as long as, and very crucially, and here's a very crucial element, it's not just the time, it's the conditions. I want, in a transitional period, to be able to negotiate agreements at that point. What we can't have is a putting off of the point at where we have freedom to negotiate our trade agreements.
Well, let me ask you about that. At the moment, is it clear that you would be able to sign any free trade deals during a transition period?
No, that's to be negotiated. That's one of the elements we will want to see.
So if Mr. Hammond is right, or even Mr. Davis, it's up to 3 or 4 years, it could be 2021, 2022 before you get to sign a free trade deal.
Well, we don't know how long any of them would take to negotiate. The point you made very correctly a little while ago is they don't happen overnight.
Would you even be able to negotiate during a transition period?
Well, I would hope we'd be able to do that. I would hope that's one of the conditions we would set.
But you might not.
I would think that that's one of the conditions we would want to set. It's certainly something that I would want to see, because otherwise it makes it much more difficult for us to take advantage of the opportunities that Brexit itself would produce.
Your ink's going to run dry before you get to sign one of these agreements, isn't it?
Well, we're not short of work. We've got a huge amount to do, and it's not just at the FTA level. I know that everyone's obsessed with free trade agreements. We have, for example, what do we get at the World Trade Organization? Because the real gain for the United Kingdom is to get a global liberalisation in the services sector. That is what would actually benefit the UK economy most.
And I want to come on to that in a minute. But before I do, are you part of this group of cabinet ministers that now seems regularly to be briefing against Philip Hammond?
No, I absolutely deplore leaks from the cabinet. I think my colleagues should be very quiet, stick to their own departmental duties, and I think that the public expect us to be disciplined and effective. Our backbenchers are furious, and the only people smiling at this will be in Berlin and Paris.
So why are they doing it?
I think there's too much self-indulgence, and I think people need to have less Prosecco and have a longer summer holiday.
They don't trust Mr. Hammond on Brexit, though, do they?
I don't think that is true. I've had a very good working relationship with Philip Hammond. I read in the press we've got very different views. In fact, our views, if you listen to what Philip said this morning, what I'm saying, are very similar on issues like transition. I don't know where the briefing is coming from, but I do know it should stop, because our colleagues on the backbenches do not like it.
But it is happening.
I'm afraid it is happening, and I think it undermines the position of the government in this massive negotiation that we've got. And we don't need an interim leader. We don't need an alternative leader. We have a very good, competent leader in Theresa May.
I understand that's you, but he thinks it's being done by your fellow Brexiteers.
Well, I don't know who's doing it, but I deplore it, whoever is doing it, and they should stop.
OK. Let's come back to this tariff-free trade, because there's much talk of that. But the Chancellor made the point, I think you were making, that he says much of our trade with the world is service trade, trade in services, not goods, and free trade deals won't make any particular difference there. Do you agree with that?
Well, they can make a difference. For example, it's been estimated by the OECD that a free trade agreement with the United States, between the UK and the United States, could add £42 billion to our bilateral trade by 2030. So there is a gain to be made. But in an economy like the United Kingdom that's 80% services, what we really would benefit from is a range of global liberalisation. Now, that would be in a number of areas. I'll give you one example, which is data. We've got an economy where we talk about the freedom of movement of goods, freedom of movement of services, but you also have to have the freedom of movement of data. One of the things I would like the UK to lead on is to look to a global agreement on that.
But as you know, global trade talks have come to an end. They failed to conclude last time. There is no great global movement to
Well, that's not quite true. That's not quite true. We've just had an international multilateral agreement, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, was signed earlier on this year, which seeks to diminish friction at customs around the world. That adds about 70 billion to the global economy, so it's not small beer.
But it leaves plenty of non-tariff barriers still in place. They're particularly important to us. And the moment you start to talk about these complicated, these rules and regulations that hinder services, it doesn't make free trade deals impossible. It makes them much more complicated and prolonged to do.
Well,
correct?
You need to look at what's actually happening in the global economy. Again, according to the OECD, that in 2012, the G7 and G20 countries were operating about 300 non-tariff barriers. By the end of 2015, they were operating nearly 3 times that number. In fact, the silting up of the growth in global trade is being done by the developed economies. So we need to be looking at how we can remove some of those barriers, because otherwise our prosperity becomes limited.
Is it still your view that no deal would be better than a bad deal?
I think anyone that goes into a negotiation without that position is foolish. And I think that those that we negotiate with need to understand that we're not going to accept any deal that they give us. I think that was the problem that David Cameron had when his negotiation before the referendum. I think our European partners believed we would accept a bad deal rather than none.
But Philip Hammond's given the game away for you on that. He says no deal would be a very, very bad outcome. We could hardly want that. The Europeans know that we realise no deal would be a very, very bad outcome. Is he right?
Well, I think you can argue on what the outcome would be, but it's very important.
Clear.
It's very important as a negotiating tool, and the Prime Minister is 100% right.
But he's given the game away.
Well, the Prime Minister is 100% right. Those we're negotiating with need to believe that we would walk away rather than accept a bad deal.
But if you're going to walk away, you don't say the consequences would be very, very bad. You don't agree with the Chancellor on this, do you?
Well, I think we can
You just told me you and the Chancellor were singing from the same song sheet. You don't on this.
I think the key on this is what is our negotiating position, and you simply don't hand it away at the beginning, and the Prime Minister's right.
Well, and Mr Hammond, therefore it follows, is clearly wrong.
Well, it may not be a great outcome, that's a different point.
No, he says very, very bad.
But we would have to accept that we have a right to walk away, and those we're negotiating with need to understand that. No businessman would go into a deal saying that whatever the outcome, I'll accept it. That would be crazy, and the Prime Minister's not going to do that.
And no business would go into a major negotiation with 6 different voices, but your government is.
Well, David Davis speaks for the government, not the Sunday newspapers.
Or Philip Hammond, clearly, on this issue.
I don't think there's any difference. Philip Hammond is very clear. He was very clear this morning on the issue of transition. He was very clear that we have to leave the single market because we're leaving the European Union, we're leaving the customs union, then we have a transitional agreement. That I think is a very consensual government position that we're arriving at.
Let me just quickly go through another of issues, because it's interesting just to get some answers, some clarity if we can. Is there a contingency plan for no deal?
Yes, government departments across Whitehall are all working on their contingency plans for what would happen if we get to the end of the negotiations with no deal.
So why did the Foreign Secretary say there is, quote, no plan for no deal?
There are contingency plans across Whitehall.
So is he just wrong or out of the loop?
Well, I don't know when that was said, but I tell you that there are contingency plans. My department and all other departments have been specifically
He said it this
tasked.
week.
He's been specifically tasked.
Secretary of State, he said it this week.
Then that's not correct, because there are contingency plans across Whitehall in case there is no deal. We would be foolish not to have such contingency plans. We'd be irresponsible not to have such plans.
Well, but I understand the argument. You just need to bring the Foreign Secretary. I mean, he is only the Foreign Secretary, but you should bring him in, I would have thought, but that's your job. Now, you want as full a free trade deal with the EU as possible. You want to get a really good, as open, as friction-free as possible. Would you be prepared to pay for that kind of open access?
Depends what you mean by pay. Presumably you mean pay in money. Well, we have to start with where we are with the European Union at the moment. We already have a tariff-free arrangement. We already have...
I know what we already have.
We already have complete regulatory equivalence. So the only reason why we wouldn't continue with that is that if the politicians on the other side of the channel wanted to put politics before economics...
But what if they said we want an annual fee?
Then I don't think that we pay for access to markets. If they're talking about Britain continuing to pay for those international arrangements that we're already continuing...
No, I'm not talking about that, and I think you know, Minister, I'm not. I'm saying if we get a full access trade deal, but they say you have to pay an annual fee for this full access, should we pay it?
Well, I wouldn't want to make a public position while our negotiations are coming on, but I think you'd find that very difficult to square, for example, with WTO law.
Has there ever been a free trade deal where you paid the other side for access?
Not that I'm aware of.
Nor me. So it would be unprecedented. But you're not ruling it out.
And I'm not going to say anything. It'd be quite wrong for me. As you correctly point out, Andrew, we shouldn't have a number of different cabinet voices ahead of our negotiation, so I'm not going to do that. And so we will have a negotiation. We will try to get as free a deal as possible. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you why it's important.
Oh, no, I know why it's important. I've got another question that is important, because you mentioned it earlier, Minister, and you've said the EU has trade deals with a number of other countries at the moment, of which we're part of the EU. South Korea, Canada, 2 examples. I think there's 30 odd, maybe more. Yeah. Will they continue to trade with us on the existing basis, or will we have to do new deals or change these deals after Brexit? We are negotiating with those third countries to ensure that we have something called transitional adoption, so that they are translated from EU law into UK law, so that at a minute after midnight there's no disruption to trade. However, so you're not clear, is it?
Well, it is very clear, but you're not quite right about the Canada deal, because Canada has not yet been ratified by the European Union.
You know what I mean. So we don't know yet if we can carry on trading with those countries that the EU already has a free trade deal with on the same basis. Well, we're trying to, but we don't know.
We have not spoken to a single country, and we've got working groups already with Switzerland, for example, Korea, which together make up about 82% by value of those EU free trade agreements for the UK. Not a single one of those has indicated in any way, shape or form that they didn't want to carry out this transitional adoption, which gives me a lot of confidence. In the case of Canada, in the case of Singapore, for example, where that agreement has not yet been reached by the EU, we'll have to think there about a plan B, about how we go into a bilateral agreement with them.
All right. Sitting back at this, just finally, Minister, I mean, the EU now regards Mrs May as a lame duck leader. That's true in Brussels, Berlin, Paris. The Cabinet now speaks in several tongues. We've heard some of these tongues this morning. They're all over the papers. There's a hung parliament. Labour's not going to save your bacon on Brexit. They want a quick election, and they'll vote to bring that about. This election result has severely undermined Britain's negotiating position, hasn't it?
Well, it's made it more difficult in terms of the parliamentary handling. But if you're looking at European governments, they're used to dealing with minority governments all the time. They're used to dealing with coalitions, formal and informal. So it's nothing new to them. The key is that we've got something stronger than that. We've got the will of the British people behind us, clearly expressed in the referendum, that we're going to leave the European Union, whatever Tony Blair or anyone else says. There is no alternative to that. We will leave in March 2019. Now the job of the government is to get the best deal, and that's best done by my colleagues being quiet, getting on with their departmental work, not involving themselves in things they don't need to be involved in, giving our backbenchers the reassurance that we've got a united cabinet.
All right. Liam Fox, thank you very much.